Hello, everyone. Welcome to another American TESOL Institute webinar. I'm your host, Jason R. Levine, better known as Fluency MC, English language teachers. We are here for you every month to help you with your professional development. And it's a joy and a pleasure to be your host. And this month, we are going to start a series of webinars that build up and across the ELT spectrum in terms of equipping new teachers and teachers who have relatively little experience, kind of starting with the basics. This is the first one, and we're going to go each month a little further, a little further. Now, that doesn't mean that if you have experience, or you're an old guy or an old gal like me, or the old guy, not the gal. I absolutely believe you will learn things from being here, whether you come live or you're watching asynchronously. But we will be, as I said, focusing on some really important fundamental things for English language teachers, whoever you teach, wherever you teach, whatever approach you decide you want to develop. Of course, you definitely need to know the basics before you go out there. But I don't mean to say that it's going to be too basic. I'm going to make a attempt to offer some knowledge about fundamentals in this first one, mainly about methods and approaches to teaching English over the years. But I'm going to add things that I don't think you'll find in most webinars about this topic, and certainly not if you're just relying on AI. Some wonderful knowledge about English language teaching you can gain through AI, but not some of the more interesting and eclectic things going on in the world. So anyway, I'm already starting to digress. Let's stay focused here. The ELT evolution from rules to results. That doesn't mean that we don't want to focus on rules now, and it doesn't mean that earlier there was no interest in results, but I think you'll see what I mean as we go along here. So let's get started with the terminology commonly used in English language teaching. Lots of acronyms. So one thing, if you're just starting out, you may be a little confused about the difference between ESL and EFL. It was really a much more distinct thing a few decades ago when there was more of a clear separation. Well, let's go into it and you'll see what I mean. So when I was teaching in the 90s, late 90s in New York City, for example, I felt like I was both an ESL and an EFL teacher because I was teaching immigrants from Central and South America at one school. And that was definitely more of an ESL situation because they were living in New York now permanently, and they needed English to work and communicate in their new lives in New York. So yes, there was more natural input outside the classroom, but we're going to get to why that isn't always a benefit or doesn't always help. EFL, I also was an EFL teacher. I felt I identified as both because I was teaching at a school for international students that came on short-term student visas, 6 weeks, 6 months, and they're going to go back to their countries. So what I wrote here about the Spanish speaker, that it actually works, and I had a lot of Brazilian speakers at the EFL school, so that's why I guess I chose those two when I wrote this. However, since that time, and maybe you're already thinking about this, English has become more widely spoken in the world. The number one reason to learn English, I'm just saying that statistically, I think I'm right, but I don't know, it seems that way, is not to communicate with native speakers of the language. For example, at the time, my example of the immigrants, this was in Brooklyn, they were learning English so that they could communicate with, native speakers primarily at their jobs and during the day when they were socializing and trying to, if possible, get citizenship or residency in the States. Not that they wouldn't use English maybe with a Korean person, especially in New York, a Korean person or an Italian person, but you know what I mean. And in the EFL context, students at the school were barely getting English outside of the classroom where they lived. But that has changed, right? So a student in the EFL context, the old EFL context, may arrive at a school in New York and already have a lot of contact with English, either in their country or through technology. So it's really blended a lot. And I don't think the distinction is as relevant as it once was, unless you're in a situation where it's clearly, one or the other. There is a lot of overlap. And that's why the term, ELT, English language teaching, and the term English language learner, we're going to get to both of those, are used much more than any others, I think, because there's more mixing and overlap. Same kind of situation here, not surprisingly, between the idea of teaching English as a second language and a foreign language. Those are more common in the UK, which is where a lot of the methodologies and focus of teaching English began. Not all of them, I mean, both in the States and in other countries too. But the TESOL, my master's is in TESOL, for example. That term I have not seen used widely in the UK. I see it used in certain countries that have more influence from American programs. So they use TESOL. But in the UK, for example, each year the annual conference is the IA TEFL. But the IA TEFL also gets into teaching immigrants the ESL thing and TESOL. I feel now TEFL. I may be wrong about this, but that in the UK and places influenced by the UK teaching of English, TEFL incorporates TESOL, and you see TESOL less often, and it's more for a certificate. I would imagine maybe in a situation, for example, in Scotland, where the program is only for immigrants who are living there, and it's so it's that ESL focus we just talked about in the previous slide. This is why ELT is such a great term, because I think if you use that, you bring everything together, and it's understood that ELT does not mean teaching English as to people as their first language. It's really an acronym that is evokes to people who know about teaching English as a second or foreign language as a second or foreign language term. So for learners, I already mentioned this before, the term ELL is great, I think, and more used. I don't remember this term from when I was starting out. I think it was, more, ESL student, EFL student. So again, ELL brings them, and, for the learner now, whether it's as a foreign language or a second language, we just talked about that. It's really mixing so much. L1 and L2 are really important terms. So the L1 obviously could be any first language that your student speaks, and the L2, the language being acquired, in this case English, but L2 could be, if you're learning Spanish as a second language, or Swahili as a second language, et cetera, et cetera. So those are not terms that are used only in ELT. Those are used in linguistics and all language teaching. Second language acquisition. That's really where we are different than the someone teaching English as a first language or whatever language is the first language. Really, really important for us to have a solid understanding of how a second language is learned as opposed to a first language, the things they have in common, the things they don't. And if a really good course to prepare to be an ELT focuses really first and foremost on second language acquisition, which leads into the methods and approaches. So, okay, if this is what we know about how a second language is learned, here's the method we propose or the approach we propose. Like, it all goes back to that, and it's fascinating, at least for me. I mean, that's how I got hooked. Was thinking about how we learn a second language compared to how we learn a first, and it's really, really interesting to see the things that are similar and the things that are different. And if you're interested in that, you will always, I think, be interested in being an English language teacher. Okay, a few more acronyms. The alphabet soup, as they say. Um, I also don't recall the CEFR being, I remember it, but being as recognized as sort of the gold standard. I feel like there were other, sort of competing models. I mean, everyone was talking about beginner, intermediate, advanced, but this was certainly the one in the States. I think there were others. I was at one of the schools I mentioned before for international students, was a UK-based school with locations in the States. So we were looking at the Cambridge levels, and I was teaching Cambridge courses. But now, I'm in places where they're doing nothing with Cambridge, nothing with UK, and I'm seeing these, and they are, I think, really useful and easy for us to follow. Of course, what does it mean to be A1 or A2? You get into, well, the different skills. You might be an A2 reader, but you can't speak at that level, or etc. But anyway, this is the first of many times I'm going to say you can explore this further, because I'm not going to go into further detail on it. But so easy today with good resources. There we go, online. But also things like this are really good with ChatGPT, Gemini, other Gen AI, large language models. In my experience, they are basically 100% accurate on basic stuff. Like this, especially ChatGPT, Gemini. I know everybody's getting into it, but I don't see it as good as ChatGPT on things like this. Maybe it just needs to be trained more. Anyway, so if you want to explore something further, I recommend going there first, and of course, it can recommend also books and articles for you to read. EAP and ESP are also useful terms and still widely used. I mentioned earlier Cambridge exams, the IELTS, for example, and the TOEFL are academic English tests. So you might be an EAP teacher preparing students for those exams, or it could be, after they take the exams. For example, I have students traveling abroad who, in the future, who already have their TOEFL or their IELTS, but they still need more academic English to prepare to study for their course of study when they go abroad. And ESP, which is funny because ESP. I don't usually use that. I usually talk about. I mean, we do say it. I usually just say English for specific purposes, but people say ESP. But I guess in fact, I think more about like, oh, I'm an English language teacher in this group. They're going to be nurses, or they're going to be accountants. So we're specializing, teaching accounting English, teaching nursing English, aviation, medical English. But that is the catch-all term. And many of us, if we don't do that specifically, find ourselves needing to do that. If we teach adult learners, for example, the first time I ever taught was with those immigrants I mentioned in Brooklyn from Spanish-speaking countries. Not all of them, but almost all from first language was Spanish. They're L1, and they were working in factories where they needed. I discovered specific terminology for that, but they also needed everyday English to live uh, in the States. Okay, so I already said how fascinating SLA is and how important it is, and we are not going to be going into different theories of second language acquisition here. That's something I'd really like to do in the future. But again, if you're taking a course like the American TESOL Institute course or other courses, you will get deeper into it. I want to really focus on the basics of it, and then when we talk about methodologies today, because that's really the focus, the methods and approaches, we will be connecting back to second language acquisition as we go along. So have you ever heard this? Kids are like sponges when they learn their first language. I imagine you have. And also when they learn a second language. Oh, it's so much easier for kids when they learn to speak another language if they learn it early. And why does that make sense to us? Because there's truth to it. Why is that? But and this is what we were saying before, where second language acquisition and first have an overlap. Being younger can make a difference, right? But it's not as simple as just being younger and being a sponge. But let's look. I think we will agree if in their first language, so I need to be careful, distinguish, I'm easing into SLA, but for first language, right, unless you're in a really bizarre situation, normal situations, socially, you're going to get a lot of language and you're going to hear the same things over and over again, so it's easier to remember them, and repetition we're going to get into more soon. Relaxed, curious, and engaged. All of these things here. What's interesting is when we look at the methods that work, the approaches that work, we're going to be focusing on these things, and that's why in a second language, really the basics, needing a lot of repetitive input. Being interested, being relaxed, not worrying so much about making mistakes, not thinking too much about how the language works. Those are second language issues as well as first language issues. So what would be the biggest difference if we're saying, oh, this is what kids do in their first language? Well, in a second language, do you always get enough exposure to input? So you might be thinking, oh yeah, if you're that student in Brazil, that EFL student from the other slide, and you're only getting English in the classroom or very little outside the classroom, there's that. Is every student in a language classroom relaxed, curious, and engaged, or on an app or doing anything in the language? And what happens if they get a little older? Is it harder to keep them curious and have them feel relaxed? What about errors? Is that an age-related thing? I think often it is. It goes with the one below, right? So we're more anxious as we, more self-conscious about making mistakes. And we also think more about how the language works. Now, thinking about how language works can be interesting, but here's the problem. If you look here, right? If we think about, okay, thinking about how the language works as, this foundation of understanding and remembering, we're missing something. Because actually, when you learn about how a language works, we're going to go into detail in a moment. Are you really getting enough of the language itself? Or are you kind of just like, you're here kind of observing how the language works? That's not the language itself. So if you look at Bloom's taxonomy, I have the arrow here for repetition of that. In this case, would be the language. And then understanding is not understanding just how it works. Look at these things. You can, explain classify, describe, discuss. Ooh, well, that's not the same thing as just as knowing how something works. So what I like to do when we're first talking about second language acquisition, well, it's that word acquisition. So let's talk about learning compared to acquisition. And this is where, second language acquisition really took off and actually informed a lot of what we know about first language acquisition, in fact. So it's not a surprise, in my view, that it's most programs of learning another language, whether it's EFL context or ESL context, are still focused so much on learning about it, because it hasn't been very long since there's been more of a focus and a need to learn English as a skill, as a skill. So, a good analogy, I think, is, computer science before everybody was using, needing a computer every day for their job. So if it's computer science, you're learning about how computers work, right? It's a fact-based thing, but knowing how to use a keyboard and a mouse and, a word processing program to write something, you know, that's a skill. For a long time, there was that issue with computer courses. It's like, this is not going to help me learn how to use the computer. Well, it's the same with English. So, we're talking, centuries of thinking about learning a language as just how to, read it, how to just understand it. You don't need to, leave the school and go use it. So it makes sense, right? It's a pretty new area, and when it started to develop more as a skills based approach, the methods and the lessons, English was not a lingua franca, right? It was important for people to learn if they wanted to work in the UK or the States or other places. But in the last couple of decades, wow, it's become something like learning to use a computer, something you just need, possibly on a daily basis, to communicate not with native speakers of the language exclusively, more often. And I said this earlier, if you're that Brazilian student, you need English to talk to someone from Japan, or you need English to talk to someone from Greece. So it's not about knowing about the language anymore. We've got to figure out ways that it's going to be more acquired, like the sponge. So here, a bicycle. How do you learn to ride a bicycle? We say learn to ride a bicycle, but it's not by studying how a bicycle works or by somebody telling you how it works. Or even just by watching somebody do it. You have to actually acquire the ability. And how does that happen? Well, getting on, trying, falling off. It's the repetition. So spoiler alert, everything's going to be about repetition soon. Oh, you see down here my credo: relax, repeat, remember. Let's talk about the difference between studying, practicing, and using a language. And this could also be studying, practicing, using anything, learning any skill. But a skill, remember. Now we're moving away from the fact-based, knowledge type of learning. So studying English, same as learning about for me. So I use the terms interchangeably. Practicing English and using English. So think about what those three things mean. I would call studying English where we help raise the awareness in students. So, this is all about second language acquisition. Do we need this part? I think we do. We do need this. So it's not that one is wrong or not necessary, but maybe one or the other is more important. We need to emphasize at a certain stage. So generally speaking, learning about the language and studying the language is not as important as the acquisition. But is it important? Well, we're not, this is, I gave you the bicycle example. If you're studying, how a bicycle works, I think, and thinking you're going to ride the bicycle, no. But could it help you in your process of learning to ride the bicycle? Sure. So here, if you understand how the present perfect works, if you know the meaning of this vocabulary word, if you know where to put your tongue to pronounce something. This could really, really help. It's really about how much you focus on it and when, I think. So, examples for kids or low-level English learners, or both. It could be just something as simple as this would be studying or learning about the language. Oh, what's the difference between the modal verb must not, or the modal phrasal modal and don't have to? And a clear explanation could really help. But again, are you going to use them more naturally, more accurately, more frequently with just an explanation? That's the issue. So it could be very nice to get an understanding of differences in how prepositions are used, but there are going to be so many exceptions, and there are going to be so many times where if you think too much about it, remember earlier, thinking too much about the language, and if you also are worrying about the errors at the same time, you're going to have a problem. So just in case you didn't get the bicycle analogy, I don't think this is how you learn to ride a bicycle. So I'm not saying that those slides before with those graphics are useless, but certainly if that's all you were doing or mainly doing, it's not going to work for you. And that's where practicing English comes in. And that's really, my whole thing. If you know what I do as Fluency MC, I'm into the practice side, because I think there's a lot on the learning about side. And using English, we're going to get to, if you combine learning about the language with lots of meaningful practice, then you're optimizing your chance to use English. So now it's acquisition over learning, and this is the repetition, right? What I like to call meaningful repetition. I don't have that word here, but if you look at things like, drills, games, songs, these are things that we naturally repeat, right? So when I say practice, when I talk about practicing English, I'm talking about repetition, and I'm not talking usually about the classroom, maybe a little bit, but classroom, better to use what you have practiced. So let's continue, and I'll explain what I mean more. Here's an example of moving from learning about the language into practice. So you could have one of these graphics like we saw before, this one about differences between say and tell. When you're saying something happened, he said that, told me that, etc. Could we take that and put it into something that is more lexical based, because the one on the left, the reported speech, is really just looking at the sentence? And what about chunking and collocations, which we'll also get to later? Okay, so now we're moving into something that we could get meaningful practice with in a song, for example. So I have a song called Say or Tell. And it's that repetition that is what we call learning by heart, not memorizing, where you get enough input that makes the practice piece essential. You could have a list of phrasal verbs, but how are you going to remember turn it off, turn it on? That's me when I still had some hair. So I have songs to practice phrasal verbs. I also make games to practice phrasal verbs. So on that slide before, different ways to do practice. Things we naturally like to repeat, like songs and games. This is Bamboozle, and you can play all my games for free there. So using English, applying what you've learned or applying what you've practiced and learned, right? If we say, okay, well, we're taking a little bit of those grammar explanations, what is the present perfect, how to use prepositions. Okay, we've done some of that. And then we've got a lot of meaningful repetition, because we know just learning about it's not enough. We need to acquire it. Oh, well, we're ready to use English. If it's something high stakes, right, like a test, a job interview, right, or you're trying to do it in the classroom where it's more controlled and it's safer, So I mentioned before, I don't think of the classroom as a place for practice. I think of it as using English, but using English in a supportive, you know, environment that is not real life in a good way, right? But you are not necessarily going to be repeating something so many times. You're going to be using again what's up here from learn this much of learning about my suggestion and this much meaningful practice. So we have examples here. And these are things that could be in the classroom or outside the classroom when it's, as I said, more higher stakes for the student. So I think you know the answer to this, or at least you know my answer to this. And I think this is the number one problem with learning a language and learning about a lot of other things too. But let's stick with learning a language, that we feel if we learn about the language, we can jump to using it. Well, in the past, it was learning about it to just learn about it. So it made sense. Oh, I have knowledge of this, and maybe I can read. But if we're talking about communication, that's not reading, and especially production, speaking and writing, that's now a skill. And to develop a skill, whether it's music, dance, sports, it's not going to be just learning about how it works. It requires practice, and that's the missing piece for a lot of people. There it is. Practice, repetition, once again. So, taking what we just talked about, or I just talked about, but hope you listened. Taking what we just focused on in terms of how we learn and acquire a second language, let's look at methods and approaches to teaching English that have called upon those things to create the method or the approach. And is a method the same as an approach? Or, my way of thinking about it doesn't mean it's the right way. Is a method is something that's really been, developed as, this, through, technically maybe scientific, research and experimentation and so on and so forth. But more that it's like, okay, we are going to follow this way of doing it, kind of laid out like this, where an approach is more, okay, for example, you could take a method, and we're going to talk about that, and bring a little of an approach to that method, so it's less of subscribing to a certain way of doing it. But anyway, it's not going to be so important for us as we're talking about this, at least not today. Are language teaching methods ever really replaced by newer ones? Think about that as we go along. But I think you'll see that in second language acquisition, what we've learned from it, it's never about rejecting something and replacing it as much as building on it. Although along the way, I'm going to argue there have been times, important times, one especially, where moving away from something and trying to replace it created a really big problem. But anyway, we'll get to that. So many, right? If you're, because you certainly don't need, I'm an English language teacher that uses this method only, or I use, this approach only. I think that's really rare. I don't, I think in the past it was less rare when there was this feeling that, that's the way we do it. And thankfully, now, and part of that has to do, I think, with how, big English is in the world, how many people are involved in teaching it and learning it, how important it is to learn it as a skill, not just a subject, that there's a lot of, mix and match, and, we're going to see shortly. But we do need to think about why we're doing it, right? So what are some of those variables? Well, age level, class size, syllabus, culture, needs, interest. So as we go along here, you might say, well, I would really wouldn't like feel comfortable with that method or approach because it seems old fashioned or it doesn't wouldn't work, regardless of who you're teaching, how old they are, where they live, etc. But other approach methods or approaches might work or not work more depending on certain things, like class size is a great example. So there are methods and approaches to teaching and learning English that seem great, but given the circumstances where you're teaching, a certain class size, or you have to follow a certain syllabus because that's the way it works, and you need to report that you're following it, etc. So this was the first one. This is, in a way, it's almost like doesn't even make sense to include it once we are recognizing, learning English. And by the way, some of these, like grammar translation, it's not just English focused. Some of them were developed more around English language teaching and learning. But anyway, obviously, we're going to be talking about English. But this is really from that era of learning about the English to learning about English to read it. But it was getting more into the practical side of things. So that's why there was a lot of criticism of it. But it was also because we weren't thinking about English more as a communicative skill as a in a second language. So this is the age-old idea of translating from your first language to the second language, and texts mainly. If you wanted to be able to read philosophy in French, or English, we're focusing on English, or English in scientific papers, for example, that could serve your purpose. But then what if you wanted to speak or listen? Well, that's where it got tough. So certainly for reading skills. Writing skills, yeah, maybe not. If it's very, very sort of fixed situations with writing that relate directly to what you've learned in the reading. Yeah, if you have this foundation. So, for example, I'm not old enough to have done grammar translation. I'm still old, so I'm going to tell you how I learned English. And if you're my age, you'll recognize that approach. But my father, for example, he did, he had a foundation, a grammar translation foundation in French, for example, a couple languages. And I think it did help when he was in France and he was trying to use it as a communicative skill. But I think he would also say it wasn't that great of a foundation. It was compared to other ways, like compared to how I learned. So I learned French in high school. This is maybe a good comparison here. I don't think it was good either, but I'll just say it's more audiolingual method. We're going to get to that soon. But also not maybe the best foundation for learning to use the language as a skill more communicatively, but infinitely better than the grammar translation method. So I think my dad suffered from he was able to get some conversational French, but I think he was so wired to think about things from a grammar translation point of view that he could never really get where he wanted to be in French in conversation. So here we go. That's a pretty big con. Since our goal as English language teachers is to help our students communicate effectively in English. The direct method was the first to really rebel against grammar translation. And this is really when the first time we're saying, okay, we need English to communicate, not just for translation purposes. And this is, I believe, I'm not a scholar of the direct method, but this I think is, I think it developed in the military. It was, people need to be able to actually speak the language. I believe this is also, I forget the name of the guy that started the direct method, but I think this influenced a lot the early English language schools in different countries, like Berlitz, for example. but I don't want to talk too much about it because I don't know that much about it. And there's a good reason, because it was really a building, a very nice connection between grammar translation and what came after it. So, any direct method, hugely important in what it recognized was necessary, and the things that are good about it were definitely carried through to the next phase. So, no translation or memorization. And this is interesting, right? Learning grammar implicitly, not focusing on rules. So, in a way, it was really ahead of its time, but we're going to see how it didn't work in certain ways. Well, here we go. So, this is really the first like classroom instruction that was, using the, target language, using, you're here to learn English, we're speaking in English. And we're talking about everyday communication. So in the military, obviously, grammar translation is not going to help you very much if you don't know how to use the language. For example, again, I think it came out of that, if I'm not mistaken, but I could be. Anyway, the focus on everyday communication and in using the target language, not your first language, that's enormous, right? But here's the thing. And kind of ironic when we see where we're going with this. They really wanted to rebel so much against the grammar rules that in fact it didn't focus enough on accuracy, and so then you're getting fossilization of errors. That's obviously arguably not as important as being fluent, but then the content they were using, yes, using the target language, but are you really getting fluent in the important functional language that you need for the situations, the topics? It wasn't really rich in that. It was more really basic, very basic sentences and minimal effort to really look what did people need to learn language functions and vocabulary. So it was really setting us up for this. And if you mention the audiolingual method today, most people will be like, "Oh God, that's the audiolingual method," and it's understandable. This is what how I learned French for sure in school, or actually, it was how they were hoping I would learn French. And if I actually really followed it, but the teachers weren't really following it either. So one of the biggest problems with audiolingual, I didn't put it here, is that if you don't really follow it, then it really doesn't work. So, and if you follow it, well, let's just look at it. This is a really important one, so we'll spend more time on this than we did on grammar translation and direct. So, it is the idea of more input, and that is huge, right? Needing to recognizing that just learning about it, oh, this is how you say this, isn't going to work. And also just speaking in English with this kind of sentence or this vocabulary, like with the direct method, no, there needs to be, if you're going to have speak accurately, your pronunciation, remember grammar, basically remember, you need repetition, and that is really, really important. And this is where drilling started, and this is set the foundation. So everything that's good that came later, in my opinion, but I'm not alone, that idea of internalizing language patterns and structures. Right now, the big problem comes, well, that's on the con side. So hold on to that. That's the really good thing about audiolingual, and being able to, I just remember how to say that without thinking so much about rules. And often it's highly accurate. Sounds good, right? But here's the problem. The repetition is good. The exposure to input and repetition is good, but what were you exposed to? It turns out most of those language drills were boring, and it wasn't about anything meaningful. It was about, okay, here, recite this conversation, repeat these, substitution drills with, the present perfect, or these certain phrases that you need, but do you really need them? Let me start again. These phrases we arbitrarily kind of gave you that really were not We didn't really think about, was this something you needed or not? And then, it's great that you're focusing on accuracy because the direct method didn't, and focusing on internalizing. But what about the focus on just, talking and expressing yourself? So fluency was downplayed. The last thing I've already mentioned many times, which is, I think, the biggest one. So what came out of this was communicative language teaching, which was all about what students' needs were, what you need to do in a conversation, and this is what how I was trained in a CELTA program to focus on communicative language teaching, which is not a method as much. You see, it's not called the communicative language method. So it brings in things from before it, especially brings in elements of direct method and audiolingual. So I think that's, it's not a method itself. It's more like taking the good things, but not all the good things anyway, coming up, the problems with CLT. But, I don't think anyone today would argue that there's a more important thing than focusing on the functional and social use of English. So functions, how do you apologize? How do you ask for advice? How do you, respond to a request? How do you use English in this situation or that situation? Vocabulary for certain topics, and most importantly, what about you personally? What are you going to need? Not everybody needs to learn every function of a language or every social use. So who are you? How old are you? Where are you going to school? What are you going to do with English? Things that we take for granted, I think, now were not included in what came before. So I think the pros, given what I just said, are self-evident. But also, let me just emphasize that authentic content side. So with audiolingual, these arbitrary kind of sentences and conversations, there was no attempt to really think about what was real and what was meaningful. And obviously, that affects your motivation, which we're going to talk about when we kind of compare audiolingual and communicative language teaching in a moment. So here's what's really important, because I think communicative language teaching is so big, and really how I teach, that what's wrong with it, I feel, needs to be what we then bring in from other places. So a big one, a big con, is the first one. So where is the input that's needed? What was great about audiolingual was there was this repetitive input focus, and that internalization of language. Can you internalize forms and structures if you kind of, okay, well, here's how you here's some great language for apologizing or for complimenting people or for saying hello. Okay, got it. Now let's go. Let's practice. But it's not up here. I have to look on the board, or I have to, or this is what's so bad. Maybe I'm translating. So isn't that ironic? It could lead to translate, because there wasn't, I think it was trying to get away from audiolingual, which we'll talk about in a moment. And this I hear all the time, and I understand it. How do you do it with large groups? And the answer is being very creative with setting up small groups and other things, especially if you're working together towards a task, which is task-based learning, which I'm getting to. This is something I've already kind of alluded to, but this is such an important thing to stop and make sure we emphasize. This is where I believe the biggest not mistake, but kind of unfortunate unfortunate thing that happened. But I will say that when I was trained with the communicative approach, I was we focused more on drilling. I mean, I've seen really a de-emphasis on drilling. Now, I'm not an expert as a teacher trainer. I do teacher training, but it's not like I'm all over the world doing that. I used to do that more, but I believe that often people associate drilling with audiolingual, and I don't want to do that. That's the old way of learning, but then you're assuming that if you are just doing things with meaningful language and functional language, students are going to be able to remember it. And if they're not able to internalize it, that's also going to be hard for motivation. So you can see there's a danger of losing motivation for both of these things: audiolingual because it's boring and not meaningful, and communicative because I can't remember this stuff. I'm not getting enough exposure to input. So I don't know if you know this expression. It's a great one. I'm always curious to know if you have it in your language and culture. Do you know it? Well, this is what I feel communicative language teaching did when it evolved from audiolingual, right? So we need the meaningful language focus for sure, but we need that practice element that we talked about earlier, the repetition. If we don't get enough repetition, and it should be interesting stuff, so not the audiolingual stuff, this is the goal. And interestingly, what came after communicative language teaching was not a rejection of it, but Krashen's The Natural Approach was a way to solve one of these problems a little bit, which was the input. So it definitely recognized that there wasn't enough comprehensible input happening in the classroom. Now, outside the classroom was another thing, and I do a lot on what we do outside the classroom. We don't have time for that so much today. But, right, communicative language teaching was so much production focused. I'm not saying it wasn't receptive at all, but, it was more production focused. So natural approach kind of, really influenced it in a good way where, okay, we need to focus on receptive skills too with exposure. And the communication strategies, English communicative language teaching had some, but well, we're going to get to that in a moment. But where was the production focus? Not as much. And the nice thing about communicative language teaching is it really did balance more the accuracy and fluency issue. So if you were really going with just the natural approach, that was one of the problems people have with it. But I don't think anyone went just with it. I mean, this is Krashen. Krashen is the main guy in the natural approach. Main guy, one of the guys. Anyway, the most famous, and he's done a lot of amazing work since then. But he had these 5 hypotheses, which I'm not going to, in the interest of time, get into in detail. But the idea of, you can read this while I'm talking, but the idea of being able to hear or read something or engage in a discussion where you are not too high above your level, but not at your level. It's like a little bit of a challenge. And that the issue with thinking about, am I going to make a mistake, right? Having that effective filter that we need to keep stress low. Remember back to kids are sponges because they're relaxed. They're not thinking so much about errors. So that was huge. Not that CLT didn't have it, but that's where I think they got most of that was from Krashen. And also this idea of the monitor, which connects to the effective filter. So this is, if you're speaking, you shouldn't think about mistakes. You don't have time to do that. And if you do, you're not going to develop fluency. So we need to keep the monitor down, and we need to keep the effective filter down. Natural order. This is debatable. I'm going to gloss over that. And here's where it really focused on acquisition over learning. And I would argue sometimes in English language teaching, there's too much of the presentation part of it where you're talking too much about rules still, where it might be better, not always, but better to focus more on acquisition. TBL, task-based learning. So this looks like TBLT, but task-based learning. It's not just language teaching or language learning, but this is, when you bring, this is definitely a method. This is really more approach to how you create lessons and what you do with the students. And it typically is used in a communicative language teaching context, right? So you're taking not just the functional language idea that's central to communicative language teaching, but you're also thinking about, practicing for things that students are going to need to do outside the classroom, and not just because they need to prepare for it, but because it's more interesting and more motivating to do that than just presentation and practicing something. So we're gonna talk about approaches to lesson planning and including task-based learning and including PPP next time. So hopefully there'll be a good bridge from this into that. So lots of pros with task-based learning. And really you might be doing this without even thinking about it. If you're doing, English for specific purposes with students. On the other hand, if you are using a textbook and it's not really motivating, it's not really working, once you learn about task-based learning, you probably see why. Because a textbook approach doesn't, serve students' goals as directly. However, however is the next slide. Lowering the effective filter we talked about, it can happen naturally if they're focusing more on something they want to do and they're working together, and that's where we can get really achieve acquisition more than learning. So the con, the first one is the big one. Not just time consuming, but also might not work with your syllabus. You have a textbook, so it's hard to implement, might not be possible to implement. However, you could, and the best textbooks do, have certain, things in the book, in the lesson planning that focuses on learning based on learning a task. This second one, again, what students' needs are. I mean, if the students, I'm not getting enough of that grammar rule, you say, well, it's implicit, you're learning it this way. If it's done right, I don't think this is an issue, but sometimes students, still kind of come at it with adult students, of course, with this idea of, I want to learn the present perfect. You say, well, you're learning the present perfect in this task. So that could be a criticism. And then we have this we're going to go through quickly. This is more actually alphabet soup. CBLT, CBI, and CLIL. Teaching through other subjects, becoming very, very common in schools in certain European countries. And it's not at all in other countries. Like very little of that happens in France, but a lot more happens in Spain, for example. Amazing, especially pros here, especially when we're thinking about if a student is going to be sort of the lingua franca thing. If you're going to be doing something in English mainly in your studies and jobs, then why not learn the language and the subject together? Difficult to find teacher. This is one of the things that holds it back, that have both. Although you don't have to necessarily have one teacher who knows both. You can go to different teachers. That works very well. I've seen that work really well. The biggest problem I see is more, it just doesn't seem like, well, actually, that the students don't have enough English at a base to be able to do it. So, for example, if a country, not France, where I am, I don't know, Poland, maybe not the best example, but whatever, maybe something like Croatia, where kids are learning English at, when they're young, then it's easier for them, right, to do. To learn English through, learn science and English together because they've got a base of the language. The lexical approach is what I'm obsessed with, and it's not a method, and it works so well with communicative language teaching. There's kind of a way I feel everything kind of goes together. And I'm going to whip through this because of time. And also, lexical approach is so easy and fun. It's the one you can whip through. So it's about chunking. It doesn't mean there aren't grammar rules. It doesn't mean words don't exist in isolation, but it means those things kind of come along for the ride. So let's ride through it. Oh, but we do pros and cons. Are there any cons? No. I'm a lexical approach guy through and through. We talked about kids learning their first language. Well, one of the things about how we learn the first language is we learn it in chunks. We don't learn, explicitly so much about grammar, etc. And engaging for most students, if you do it in a communicative way. It's the exposure. As far as I'm concerned, the only problem with lexical approach is exposure. Or if you're saying, oh, we're not going to use it communicatively, but that's crazy. So if you're doing, a communicative approach, especially task-based with communicative, and you're working lexical approach in, the only issue you may have is not enough repetition or exposure, and that's the practice piece. So I believe I have a lot in here about the lexical approach, which is why I'm going to go kind of quickly through it. And I often give talks about this where we go into more detail, but it's about the chunks of lexis, the collocations, more than it's about grammar. That's how the language is looked at, right? So collocation is the big thing. So do homework or make homework. My daughter once said when she was very little, Daddy, I'm making my homework. And I said, oh, you're doing your homework. And she probably said, oh, yeah, I'm doing my homework. I like to do homework. It's fun to do homework. She repeated it. That's how she learned it in the first language. How can we get students at different ages with, who are not learning the language as their first language, that kind of exposure to chunks and in a way that's motivating and communicative? Well, you could but this is back to what we said before. It's nice to have a list of things, but we can't just get those chunks into our heads by looking at it and reading it. But we need to figure out a way to do that because, as I feel very strongly, that we're going to look at it again, that base in Bloom's taxonomy of language is chunks. It is collocations. And we need to be able to recall them quickly. And you can have the best chart, the best textbook on collocations, but without enough exposure, you're not going to internalize them. There it is. So, just in case you're not convinced about how the lexical approach works, I would argue, and I hope you would agree, that in a very basic fundamental sense, because in French, there's, you say écouter la musique, so you say listen the music. And in English, you say listen to music. You don't say écouter à musique. Those differences have nothing to do with, what's right or wrong, obviously, but even studying the differences, whether it's translation, with grammar translation, we know that doesn't work. But if you're also just, in a communicative language context, it's listen to music. That's great, but when are you going to get your brain to just automatically know it's listen to music? And that's when you are getting enough exposure. I don't think anybody, unless you're just learning the language at the start, says I wanted going because I wanted to go sounds and looks right. A little bit higher level, if that was like A1, A2, B1. I don't think most B1 students would say, I enjoyed to go. They might say it, but if they had a choice, they'd be like, enjoyed going sounds better. Well, that's because you've heard it enough. It's not about studying a rule of infinitives and gerunds. But here, this would be harder. You'd probably need to be B2 or C1 to be 100% sure. And why? Not because it's more difficult, but because the chunk that is correct, which is, I hesitated to do something, is less frequent. So you need to see it and hear it more often. So that's where chunking and exposure go together, and the lexical approach did not focus enough, in my very strong opinion, on the exposure part the way that audiolingual did. So this is why, marrying approaches, integrating them, whatever you want to call it, is key. So this is my strong conclusion about how we should think about second language learning. And if you see here, the critical creative thinking skills and communicative goals, that goes on top. It's probably coming up again, the pyramid. Oh, it's not, but you know what I'm talking about. What's used most in the world today? Definitely communicative language teaching and task-based language teaching. If we're talking about, I guess we should say, the kind of best programs or the best books are going to be focusing on those two things, and not exclusively. They certainly go together. You can't do any task-based learning that isn't communicative. So for me, the best combination, and this is a good kind of summary of what I've been talking about. I recently wrote this, so I'm not sure if it sounds. I'm going to read it. We'll see if it makes sense. Communicative language teaching. This is my recipe, right? Heavily influenced by the natural approach, which the best CLT already is, and the lexical approach, again, which I think the best communicative language teaching already is, that prioritizes, capital P, see, I knew there'd be a mistake, that prioritizes task-based learning, and here's the big one, maximizes opportunities for meaningful practice outside the classroom. And that's because in the old days, it was harder to say you can get repetition outside the classroom in a meaningful way. Now with technology, like with phones and with YouTube and watching videos, I mean, you could before repeat the same games and the same songs, but not as much outside the classroom as you can now. And that was really the problem before, because, if you say, well, the classroom should be somewhere where you're communicating. Agreed. But you can't communicate successfully if you don't have language up here to use. So I talk a lot about repetition, meaningful repetition outside the classroom. I'm not going to do that right now, but I will again soon with these webinars. And I want to leave you with the formula for fluency, which is based on accuracy. And I think if you look at this and reflect on what we talked about today, it makes sense. And as always, I like to say, practice makes perfect is okay, but perfect sometimes gives us the feeling of, I can't make a mistake. Remember that focus on error, that's a problem. Practice makes progress, but even better, what about when it's internalized, when you've got those chunks up here and you're ready to use them in a communicative activity? Practice makes permanence. And above all else, what we learn with pleasure, we never forget. My friends, I'm sorry if I rushed a little, but I'm hoping that in places where I rushed, you will investigate further on your own. And then next month, I will be picking up kind of where we left off, moving into more, lesson planning, what happens in the classroom, based on the methods and approaches we talked about today. If you would like a copy of these slides, I'm happy to send them in a PDF. Just email me, support@fluencymc.com. Also, if you have questions or comments about anything from this webinar, you are more than welcome to contact me. I love getting email from teachers who watch these webinars. Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks so much to American TESOL Institute for making these webinars happen, and for including me as the host. Great to be here as always. See you next month. English language teachers worldwide. Peace, respect, salute. Bye-bye.